Grab a seat. We'll get started here with our Sunday morning Bible class. Good to see everyone this morning. Glad you're able to be out with us, spend time studying God's Word together this morning. Bart and Brenda had the opportunity to go to Evansville, where Andrew is going to be preaching this morning, and so they took that opportunity to take off this weekend. So Bart asked if I would fill in for him. So we're gonna cover as much as we can. He tasked me with trying to cover all of chapter 7 and as much of chapter 8 as we can. So we'll see what happens this morning. We'll just go until the bell rings. Before we dig in here to Mark chapter 7, let's bow together, have a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, God, we are so honored to be able to come before you, to be able to bring our cares and our concerns to you, to know that you are listening, to know, God, that you are there for us and you care for us. We're so blessed, Father, to have your word as guidance for our lives. We pray, Father, that we look to it regularly, that we can better understand how we can serve you and how we can live in a way that brings honor and glory to you. Father, I pray that you bless us in our study this morning. Pray that we are challenged by the words found in Mark chapter 7 and 8, and that we can come to love your Son more as a result. Thank you most of all for Jesus. Thursday we pray. Amen. Mark chapter 7 is where we are going to begin. But just by way of preliminary things, as Bart has been doing throughout this quarter, we want to consider our theme verses for this quarter. So just as we've done in the past, we want to quote this together. We want to commit these verses to memory. So let's begin together here in Mark chapter 1 and verse 1. The Bible says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." That's Mark chapter 1 and verse 1. Here's our second one. Mark chapter 10 and verse 45. The Bible says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." All right, let's commit these verses to memory as they're foundational pieces here for the study of the book of Mark. Again, as we have done each class this quarter, here's a map of the area of the ministry of Jesus that we're going to be talking about here. And just so you can kind of place things as we're studying together this morning, the majority of our discussion is going to be in the upper part of our map. Later on here in the text, we're going to be up in Tyre and Sidon, which again are up along the Mediterranean coast and the northern part there. And so most of the events that take place during our study this morning are all going to be up in the northern part of our map. Okay, so just want you to be aware of that as we're moving through our discussion this morning. So let's get into Mark chapter 7. As we begin Mark chapter 7, Jesus has a run-in, as he does often in his ministry, with some of the scribes and the Pharisees. And in this discussion, there's a lot of talk about the traditions of the Pharisees and of the Jews compared to the law and the commands of God. And we're going to see how those two ideas, they butt heads in this text, and we're going to notice how Jesus deals with that situation. So as we start here, let's read together the first 5 verses as we kind of get into the context of Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 1. It says, "The Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. Now when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they received and hold, like the washing of cups and pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. Then the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?" All right, so here's our context of this whole discussion. The scribes and the Pharisees, they come and they find Jesus and his disciples, and his disciples are eating bread without having washed their hands. And we're told that the scribes and the Pharisees, they find fault in the disciples, verse 2. It's interesting, though, to consider under what grounds or what authority were they finding this fault. You know, I was talking with Haley this morning about how there are a lot of things that different places or different people hold to be cardinal sins if you do it, right? You think about in the South and someone that orders unsweet tea, right? It's almost a cardinal sin. What are you talking, unsweet tea? You think about in Texas, if you make a chili that has beans in it, right? That's a cardinal, that's not chili. That's something different. That's a different kind of soup. In different regions, different places, there are things that people consider to be cardinal sins. And if you do them, people are going to get upset about it, right? Maybe you can think of other regional things. But it's interesting because maybe there's no real grounds for this being the standard for truth. But to those people, that is the truth. And they will fight tooth and nail when someone disagrees with that statement. It's interesting, that seems to be what's going on here with the Pharisees. All right, they are finding fault in the disciples because they're eating with unwashed hands. But what's interesting is at the end of verse 3, they said it's because they are not holding to the traditions of the elders. The Jews and the Pharisees, they had these traditions, these standards that they held to be truth. And if you don't do these things, then you are committing a cardinal sin. See, in this circumstance, it's this idea of this ceremonial washing of hands that was passed down from generation to generation through the Jews. This was not a command from God, but this was taken farther and farther than what God's command called for and held to be the truth or a standard. We're told that the Pharisees, they went so far that when they would go to the marketplace, they would have to go through the ceremonial cleansing before they would eat or touch any kind of food. Again, not a standard of God, but a standard according to the Pharisees. So as they come and they find the disciples who are eating this bread without going through the ceremonial cleansing, they find fault in the disciples because they have broken the traditions of men. It's interesting, and we don't have time to dig into what exactly all this means, but in verse 4, we see that a number of these other traditions are mentioned. The washing of cups and pitchers and copper vessels and couches and these different things that they had raised to a standard of law, but God had no saying about those at all. They were just traditions. Yes? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Denise says it reminds her of the statement, cleanliness is next to godliness. Right? It makes sense. You can kind of see that connection there. As we get into verse 5, here the Pharisees, they begin questioning. Why do your disciples not walk according to the traditions? Why is it that your disciples reject these traditions? It's an interesting question to me that's brought up. These are the religious leaders of the people. the ones that are supposed to know the law. They're the ones that people go to for questions about the law. And the question they ask isn't, why aren't your disciples doing what God said to do in the law? Their question was, why are your disciples not obeying the traditions that we have come up with? Interesting where we find the authority here, right? Why aren't they obeying our authority? Why aren't they submitting to what we say and what we come up with and what we think is right? They've pushed God to the side and held their standard and their truth to be on just the same level. But Jesus, starting in verse 6, responds to the Pharisees. Notice with me verses 6 through 13. He answered and said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, and their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things.' He said to them, 'All too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is Corban, that is, a gift to God. Then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition which you have handed down, and many such things you do.'" This is a heavy statement from Jesus. And he starts out pretty hot. All right, verse 6. You know what? Isaiah prophesied about you hypocrites. You know, sometimes we see Jesus, when he's dealing with people, approach them in a kind and tender way and help shape them and mold them and lead them and guide them. And other times you see Jesus come in and just lay it down. Look, here's the truth. You're supposed to be the religious leaders, helping to lead people in the knowledge of the law and lead people to the truth about who God is. But here, you're nothing more than hypocrites. He said Isaiah had prophesied about them. See, Isaiah had said that they would honor God with their lips, but their heart would be far from him. See, the Pharisees were good at putting on a show and making people think that they were of a high standard in the religious world. They were good at doing things to be seen by men. But Jesus said all of that doesn't matter if your heart's not in the right place. None of that matters if your heart isn't where it needs to be. You know, this is a theme we see run through Jesus' discussion with the Pharisees all throughout his ministry. And it's really honestly, it's a discussion he has with his disciples on a regular basis too. Your heart needs to be in the... And when we get into chapter 8, Jesus goes into this very idea with his disciples where he challenges them, why are you being more like the Pharisees than being who I'm calling you to be? Why is your heart more like with the Pharisees rather than shaping it and molding it into the image of God? It's a heart problem that we see run throughout all of the New Testament, throughout the ministry of Jesus. But the truth is, today, a heart problem is really the core of a lot of the struggles that we face in our lives as Christians. When our heart's not in the right place, then everything else begins to fall apart. Our commitment isn't there. Our passion isn't there. Our drive, our motivation, when our heart's not there, then maybe we're no better than the Pharisees. It's interesting. Our heart's something we need to keep in mind and focus on all the time to ensure that our heart is where it needs to be. Not only did Jesus talk about how they were trying to honor God with their lips, but their heart was far from him, but he said there was a result that came with their heart being in the wrong place. Verse 7, he said, in vain they would worship God. Their worship was empty. It was worthless. It was nothing to God. It meant nothing to them because their heart was in the wrong place. You see, when they became so concerned about their own teaching and their own traditions that it became on the same level, the same standard as the laws of God, then Jesus said, your heart is wrong, and as a result, nothing you do brings honor to God as you intend it to do. Interesting to think about. Jesus, after he talks with the Pharisees here and addresses the Pharisees, he gathers the multitude together to further explain this message and help them understand his point. Look, starting in verse 14. When he had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him. But the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. So here Jesus kind of boils down this statement. I'm sorry, I skipped over some stuff. Let's back up. Really important part of the text here. 9 through 13. Jesus goes a step further here. And this is where he really addresses the tradition aspect of this discussion. And Jesus quotes from two places in the book of Exodus. He quotes from Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12 and Exodus chapter 21 and verse 17, where he said, the law says, Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father and mother, let him be put to death. All right, so here is a command from God given to Moses, a command of the old law that you are to honor your father and mother. And if you don't, there are consequences, right? And there were serious consequences under the old law. If you don't honor your father and mother, the punishment is death, stoning. They're to be put to death. That's a serious charge, right? And a command by God. But Jesus makes the point that because of the traditions of the Pharisees, they began rejecting the commands of God. He said that because of their tradition, there were people would come in and they would dedicate some of their stuff to God. Again, this is kind of a general idea of what's happening. But they would dedicate some of their things to God as a gift to God, and Jesus called it Corban here in the text. They would honor it, gift it to God, and then when their father or mother would be in need, the Pharisees would say, sorry, you've already given that stuff. You can't take that and give it to your mother and father who are in need. I'm sorry, it's already dedicated. So now these people, when their father and mother may be in need, and the very things that could help them were in their possession, they couldn't help their parents because of the tradition of the Pharisees. And here's Jesus' point. God gave you a command to honor your father and your mother. This wasn't a suggestion. This was a command that if you don't do it, you're put to death. But here the Pharisees have this tradition that say when you give something make something a Corban, a gift to God, that it can only be used for God and you can't use it for anything else. And so they would push people to give everything to God. And then when someone was in need, they couldn't use it to help people. So now their traditions were overshadowing the commands of God. Because of their tradition, they were causing people to directly disobey a command written to them by God. Again, their traditions had not only become equal to the laws of God, but their traditions overshadowed the laws of God. They took it a step farther. Jesus, as he's addressing the Pharisees, he's challenging them to understand that they are not God. Although, in their minds, to a certain degree, they have made themselves God. All right, so this gets us in to verses 14 through 16, where Jesus addresses the multitude. And here he summarizes this discussion, and he shifts this focus from physical defilement to spiritual defilement. Right? It all started, this whole text started with a physical defilement where the disciples didn't ceremonially wash their hands. And now Jesus helps them understand that their spiritual shortcomings are far more important than the physical shortcomings. See, Jesus here, he says that it's not unclean hands that defile a person, but it's an impure heart that defiles a person. He said it's not what enters the man from the outside that defiles him, but it's the things that come out of him that defile him. It's what's sitting in his heart. See, Jesus' point to the Pharisees was that they were more concerned about these traditions than the truth. They were more concerned about the disciples' unwashed hands than their impure hearts. They were more concerned about their laws than God's laws. You know, I'm not sure what this scene looked like after this statement from Jesus. We're not really told what happens. I can imagine, though, that the Pharisees were probably in an uproar. I don't know the last time you can remember when someone came to you and told you that something that you've been doing, that you have practiced all your life, is wrong and you shouldn't be doing it. But a change in who we are and what we believe and what we've stood on for so long, that's a hard thing, a hard pill to swallow. And here Jesus just says, look, these traditions that you've bound on so many people, those are worthless. Those mean nothing. You need to get rid of those things, because all you're doing is you're being a hypocrite for doing it. And I can imagine, I can picture the scene of there being an uproar. But here's what's interesting. We're not told what happens. Instead, starting in verse 17, we see that Jesus and his disciples, they get away. They go and they enter into a house away from the situation. Maybe it's because of the chaos that ensues. Maybe it's because they just need a quiet place to think. But what's fascinating about it is as Jesus gets away with his disciples, they failed to understand what Jesus had been talking about too in this passage. Notice, starting verse 17. It said, when he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he said to them, are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him? Because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods? And he said, what comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All of these things come from within and defile a man. You know, it always amazes me as I read throughout the Gospels how often the disciples failed to understand who Jesus truly was too and understand his teaching. You know, they spent so much time with him and sat at his feet every day and saw him perform miracles and witnessed all the incredible things that Jesus did, yet they still struggled to understand his message. You know, I told you in chapter 8 that Jesus addresses his disciples about their heart issue. Here's another, we see it happening. They're with Jesus all the time, but yet they're still struggling to grasp what's going on. And Jesus begins again to explain to his disciples what's taking place. He said, verse 18, whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him. Something that's interesting that I had never noticed before, but when I was talking with Bart about this text, he pointed it out to me, and so I did a little research on it. Verse 19, he said, because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods. What's interesting about that statement is it's that last part is actually it's not part of Jesus's quote here in this text, but it's described almost as Mark's explanation of what Jesus is saying. When he says, thus purifying all foods, it's an allusion to what we really see take place in Acts chapter 10, where, if you remember, the gospel is open and revealed to the Gentiles as well, and all of this is taking place, but this vision comes to Peter about this, all of the animals being clean and free to eat under this new law. Right? We understand. We know under the old law there were commands about which animals to eat. Some were clean, some were unclean, and you're to avoid certain animals. But under the new law, everything was made clean. And here in Mark chapter 7, Jesus makes this allusion to this teaching that we find in the new covenant. This discussion that Jesus is saying, you know, it's not food that's going to defile you. You know, under the old law there were commands, but it's not unwashed hands, it's not type of food. Those kind of things aren't what really defiles a man. It's not the physical things that defile a man. It's what's in his heart. It's what's in his heart. He said it's what comes out of a man. And he mentions here in verses 21 through and 22 the things that are within a heart that truly defiles a man, that truly defiles us. Evil thoughts and adulteries and fornications and murders and theft and covetousness and wickedness and deceit, lewdness and evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. Those are the things that truly defile someone. You know, as I think about this passage, I wonder how often do we get caught up in things that really don't matter? How often do we hold our own personal ideas and thoughts about things at such a high standard that they upset us to a point that we're more upset about those than we are about spiritual things? You know, as human beings, we're petty. And that's been the case forever. Right? It's not a new. We see it in the ministry of Jesus. We see it with the Pharisees. We see it in the disciples, where we have our ideas that these have to be true. This is the way it has to be, and it's because we've convinced ourselves of that. But yet, we allow other things to happen that are contrary to God's will, and they don't bother us like they should. I wonder if sometimes we are more like the Pharisees than we like to admit. And again, that goes back to the heart problem. Yes, ma'am.
Two things on that. You're talking about the disciples not understanding who Jesus is. They have been conditioned, just like everybody around them, to look for a certain kind of Messiah. And even though they recognize that Jesus is the Messiah, he's not the kind of Messiah that they have been conditioned to look for, so he doesn't look right, okay?
Yeah.
Fixed images remain regardless of education. It's there, it's in there. Changing our mind and our thoughts is very difficult. That's the first place. In the second place, we can't see into other people's hearts. So, being the judgmental, petty people that we mostly are, most of the time, we judge based on appearance and behavior that we can see.
Yeah.
Because we can't read hearts. We don't know what's on somebody else's mind unless they tell us, and they don't always tell us the truth, and we know that. So, like I said, we judge based on what we can see. It's not fair and it's not right, but it's very moral.
Yeah, good point. Sandy makes 2 points. One, she says that the disciples, maybe they failed to understand who Jesus was or grasp it because they had a very specific image of what they thought the Messiah was going to look like. And Jesus looked very different than what they had thought the Messiah was going to be. So maybe there was some challenge there for them to grasp it. Her second point was we judge based on what we can see. We are judgmental people as human beings, but we judge based on appearance, based on what we can see and what we can witness. Which again, and that's really all we can judge on. Jesus could see the hearts of people, and that's why he so often talked about the heart problems in people. We can't see the heart, so we just have to judge on the physical. So great point. Any other thoughts before we move forward?
I think this heart issue is both a mental and a physical, or spiritual and a physical being. Because if we keep feeding all of this stuff that's bad for us to our heart, we're going to do damage. But it's the same way spiritually.
Yeah, it's a great point. Elise makes the comment that really there's a physical and a spiritual element to this heart problem. Right? We think about our physical heart. When we continue to feed ourselves junk, our heart struggles. Right? It's going to cause problems. And the same thing is true spiritual. When we feed ourselves spiritual junk, we can expect our heart is going to be full of things like what Jesus described here. If we want our heart to be as God calls it to be, we got to feed it the right things. Great point. All right, let's keep going. Since we're running out of time, and people are going to start calling me Bart if we don't even get through a chapter. So let's move forward here. Verses 24 through 30, we see a healing that takes place. And again, we won't read this whole text, but we'll kind of hit some of the highlights and understand what takes place here. Here Jesus is traveling, again, to the northern part of our map, up to Tyre and Sidon. And in verse 24, Jesus enters the city, and he tries to enter incognito. He doesn't want people to know, but the Bible says that he could not be hidden. There were so many people looking for him that when he'd enter into new places, people were always found him. So he could not be hidden. And one of the people that found him was this woman who had a young daughter who had an unclean spirit. And she came and fell at his feet, and she was wanting Jesus to heal her daughter. A few interesting things we find out about this woman. She was a Syrophoenician, which basically means she's from Syria, or from Phoenicia, which is in Syria. But one of the things that's interesting to note is we're told that she is a Greek or a Gentile. Now, why might that be important? Why might that be an interesting note? Because she wasn't a Jew, right? Majority of the ministry of Jesus to this point has been to the Jews. Maybe the exception of when he traveled over and healed Legion. Right, that was in a Greek area. But other than that, his ministry has been to the Jews. And now we see the shift as he moves up into Tyre and Sidon, where he begins this ministry to some of the Gentiles. But we'll see how this plays out here in this text. We're told that this woman, verse 26, she kept asking Jesus. She was persistent. She had a need, and she went to Jesus, and she continued to ask him because she knew Jesus could help. But Jesus makes a really interesting statement in verse 27. Jesus said to her, "Let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." It's always interesting as I read this verse. If we're not careful, we can look at this and, man, Jesus was being really derogatory to this woman. Right? You think about calling someone a dog, and I mean, he doesn't know this woman. She's just come to ask for help, and now he's calling her a dog. Likely this was a common adage that was used by the Jewish people in reference to the Gentiles. Right? We know there was this feud between the Jews and the Gentiles, and more than likely this was a common phrase that was used. And the point Jesus was making is, why would you, a Gentile, come to me, a Jew, asking me for help when most Jews consider you a dog? But why would you come to me? And her response to Jesus is really interesting in verse 28. She answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." I understand, Jesus, that typically your ministry has been for the Jews, and I understand there's a disconnect between Jews and Gentiles. But even the little dogs see the benefit of what you have to offer. And we want it, and we need it. We recognize you have the power and you have the ability to help. And we're coming to you. We recognize who you are and your authority. Jesus, when he hears this statement from this woman, he immediately heals this woman's daughter and sends her on her way, where she finds her daughter who is healed and laying in her bed. It's interesting that we've been talking all chapter long about a heart problem among the Jews. Then here's this Gentile woman who sees Jesus and wants nothing more than just to be with him. Interesting how that shift takes place there. But this, again, kind of begins Jesus' ministry in dealing with some of the Gentiles, and we see it continue here in this next passage in verses 31 through 37, where again Jesus heals a man who is deaf and is mute. Again, we don't have time to really dig into all of this, but we see where this man is brought to Jesus who is deaf and has this impediment in his speech, and Jesus touched the man's ears and his tongue, and said, "Be open," and the man was immediately healed. And we're told, verse 37, that they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." He's, again, here in this Gentile land, and the people are marveling at what Jesus is doing. He's able to bring hearing to the deaf and help the mute speak. And look what he's capable. Look at his power. Look at his authority. And people were in awe of what Jesus was able to do. So as we transition into chapter 8, and I'll just kind of introduce some ideas here, since we only got 5 minutes left. We're not told exactly what happens here, but it seems as though maybe in chapter 8, Jesus continues in this Gentile area. And if you remember, back in chapter 6, Jesus was around Jews, and he did this incredible miracle where he fed the 5,000, right? Now we see here in chapter 8 a very similar story take place, but it's among a Gentile audience, probably, where he does a very similar, he feeds the 4,000. And just kind of a summary of what takes place here is we're told in verses 2 and 3 that Jesus felt compassion for this multitude. They had been traveling with him for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. And Jesus tells his disciples, because I have compassion for them, let's take care of their needs. And just as the disciples had done back in Mark chapter 6, they began questioning Jesus. Verse 4, his disciples answered him, "How can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness?" What do you mean? How are we going to feed these people, Jesus? How are we going to provide for their physical needs out here? There's no place to get food. If you remember in Mark chapter 6, they even said, we don't have the money to go and buy food even if we wanted to. It's almost the same story happening over. They just witnessed what Jesus was able to do for a multitude in Mark chapter 6, and now the same situation taking place. And how are we gonna help these people, Jesus? How quickly they forget. But Jesus, just as he did in Mark chapter 6, he gathered together what they had. They gathered their loaves. They had 7 loaves of bread. Verse 5. Verse 7, they had a few small fish. And Jesus blessed. I guess I can move forward to chapter 8 too. Jesus blessed the food and set it before the people. And all of them were fed, and they collected 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Again, a very similar story to what takes place in Mark chapter 6. But we're going to skip forward just a little bit, just because I want to allude to something that Bart will cover more next week. I was talking about the heart problem that we see in the disciples. If you move forward here, it's in verses 11 through 23. Jesus talks about these warnings about the Pharisees, and again, I'll let Bart jump into that. But notice in verses 13 through 21, there is a discussion. Jesus gets very pointed with his disciples. You see, they are, again, not seeing Jesus as he should be, and he challenges them. He says in verse 18, having eyes you do not see, having ears you do not hear, and do you not remember? Do you not remember? And then he says, think back, verse 19. Think back to the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and the 5,000 that were fed. And then he asks them, how many baskets were left over? He wants to make sure they remember the event. 12 baskets. Do you not remember the 4,000 that we just took care of, that we just provided for? And how we had just 7 loaves of bread and a few little fish. And do you remember how many baskets of leftover we had? Wait, 7. Jesus looks at his disciples and he said, you've witnessed my power and you've witnessed my ministry. Why do you so soon forget who I am? So soon forget my power, and so soon forget my authority, and so soon forget who I am. I wanted to get to this point because I think Jesus is talking to us here. When our faith falters, Jesus is asking, do you not remember what I've done for you? Do you not remember who I am? Do you not remember what I'm capable of? So often, our faith falters because we forget the God that we serve. And we forget his power. And we forget what he can do in our lives when we trust in him and lean on him and know that he's in control. We see the disciples struggle with it. But we too falter in our faith when we forget to remember who Jesus truly is in our lives. Thank you all. Appreciate your attention. Appreciate your comments. Hope you all have a great rest of the day.